Hello everyone, we are on chapter 7 and we are on paragraph 22, so let's get started. Without such assumptions, the world would fall apart for the naive realist into an incoherent aggregate of percepts without mutual relationships and with no tendency to unite. It is clear, however, that naive realism can make these assumptions only by an inconsistency. If it would remain true to its fundamental principle that only what is perceived is real, then it ought not to assume a reality where it perceives nothing. The imperceptible forces which proceed from the perceptible things are in fact unjustified hypotheses from the standpoint of naive realism. And because naive realism knows no other realities, it invests its hypothetical forces with perceptual content. It thus ascribes a form of existence, perceptible existence, to a sphere where the only means of making any assertion about such existence, namely sense perception, is lacking. And we have 22 summarized as follows. If naive realism is to remain true to its fundamental principle that only the perceived is real, it should not assume a reality where nothing is perceived. The imperceptible forces which proceed from the perceptible things are unjustified hypotheses. So what Steiner is pointing out in this paragraph is that naive realism is not being consistent, because if they believe that only what is real can be perceived, then they should not be trying to explain things that aren't perceivable, which is what they are doing in cases such as in their description of, as he mentions earlier, the divine being or whatnot. So there is an inconsistency here, and that is what Steiner is pointing out in this paragraph. And so it, as he mentions, it ascribes a form of existence to a sphere where only the means of making any assertion about such an existence, namely sense perception, is lacking. And that is not consistent, is because it's talking about something that isn't there, but yet its whole premise is that what is real can be perceived. So I'm going to move on to 23, and that's short. Paragraph 23. This self-contradictory theory leads to metaphysical realism. This constructs, in addition to the perceptible reality, an imperceptible reality, which it conceives on the analogy of the perceptible one. Therefore, metaphysical realism is of necessity dualistic. And 23 is summarized as follows. This self-contradictory theory leads to metaphysical realism, which is dualistic. I think that's a pretty straightforward paragraph, but as you can see in his description of naive realism, is that it starts to become metaphysical. And metaphysical meaning it's talking about things that aren't perceptible, and then it becomes metaphysical, and it leads to these concepts of God and the universe and all this other stuff, but yet it's not directly perceived. So that's what he means by it's becoming metaphysical realism, and metaphysical realism is dualistic. And we're going to move on to paragraph 24. So that's what he's pointing out here. He will talk more about metaphysics in the next few paragraphs, so let's just move on then. Wherever the metaphysical realist observes a relationship between perceptible things, such as when two things move towards each other, or when something objective enters consciousness, there he sees a reality. However, the relationship which he notices can only be expressed by means of thinking. It cannot be perceived. The purely ideal relationship is then arbitrarily made into something similar to a perceptible one. Thus, according to this theory, the real world is composed of the objects of perception which are in ceaseless flux, arising and disappearing, and of the imperceptible forces which produce the objects of perception and are the things that endure. So 24 summarized as follows: for this theory, metaphysical realism believes that the real world is comprised of the objects of perception which are in constant flux, and of imperceptible forces which produce the objects of perception that endure. I think that paragraph is pretty clear. He's talking about metaphysical realism, creating a world of something that is perceptible and something that's imperceptible, which produces the objects of perception, which is the thing that endures. And Steiner will talk more about this later, but as you can see already, it kind of, his theory conflicts with this, because for him, the world of ideas, thinking, that is the world that endures. And so that already metaphysical realism is creating this world known as an imperceptible forces, and that doesn't really make that, and that doesn't make sense, because what do they mean by imperceptible forces? I mean, what do you mean imperceptible forces produce the objects of perception? I mean, you can already start to see where it's going wrong there, because there isn't such thing as something that is producing the objects of perception. I mean, they're there already. And so he's pointing out already some of the flaws in this theory. So that's all for today. Paragraph 25 is pretty long, so I don't think we'll be able to cover that today. What else can I say? He's just, again, pointing out these theories and whatnot, and it's important to understand how his theory stacks up to other theories that are, in his day, were very predominant. Like naive realism, is, I think, still a common view for people, because people think, well, if I can't see it, it's not real. But then they have a very weird way of explaining things in the world, and they do use non-perceptible terms to explain them. And metaphysics, I think, is still something today that is relevant. But I mean, people aren't really aware that they kind of subscribe to this worldview of, not worldview, this theory of knowledge, that they are metaphysical in their thinking, or they're naive realists in their thinking. Most people aren't really aware of their own personal theory of knowledge, but these things are, I think, still applicable in today's world, although we don't normally talk about it. So I'm gonna just end it there. So if you have any questions, just send me a message. Bye.